Our speaker this evening is John Hubbard, and John has given numerous talks to us in the past about George Eliot, M Forster, Thomas Hardy, Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, painting and architecture. And this must be about his 8th talk to us. John is a retired schoolmaster, having taught at Bournemouth School and also Bournemouth School for Girls. By all accounts, he was a legendary teacher. I know he's going to be really embarrassed now for me saying that. But his talents are not being wasted. He now has 2 U3A classes in literature and drama. So he's continuing with those activities. And tonight he's going to be talking to us about I suppose the ordinary architecture that can be found in the villages of Dorset. So will you please give John a very warm welcome. And I'm going to dim the lights so that we can see the screen more easily.
Okay, thank you, David, for that. Now, as history has all too often been the story of the influential and the powerful, architectural history has also been the story of the grand, of the mansion, of the manor and the rectory. Some of the reason for this is fairly obvious. It's that the archive and documentation connected with these larger houses and with acts of governing and building has often been more consciously preserved, partly as a confirmation of the importance, or one might say self-importance, of various families or individuals, so that plans and correspondence are kept for generations. It's a rather different thing commissioning a London architect to renew your dynastic home in the latest style than coming to a verbal agreement with a neighbouring builder to put up a row of cottages in the local fashion, or to use your own and the community's skills to erect one for yourself. A master mason and his team, or a more ordinary builder, would work from common knowledge, from sketches and well-tried models handed down through generations, refined through experience, a kind of pattern book and practice stored in the head. So while it may be easier to note more impressively formal rectories and manor houses, if you can glimpse them behind their walls and protective screening, and I will allude to them, the vast majority of houses in a Dorset village are on a considerably smaller scale, but remarkably often housing families that were no less extensive in number. For every manor house and vicarage in a substantial mid-19th century manorial parish, you may have had, say, 3 to 5 farms, some close, some outlying, and centrally gathered clusters of maybe 30 attached and single cottages, and a range of maybe half a dozen slightly larger houses for the more prosperous members of the community. Many that remain today go back some 300 or 400 years. 1 or 2 are even older. You'll probably find a school of some sort and perhaps some ancient almshouses. Sometimes, as you wander, you'll be surprised at the scale of the rectory or vicarage in relation to a very small parish, which can be explained by the relationship of the incumbent to the manorial family, who often controlled the appointment or presentation, usually for a younger son. So we have a range of buildings and smaller building types dependent both on church and landowner, which in themselves will show local variation. And this richness and variety is what makes travel, even from one end of a single county to another, fascinating and various. As a particular study, the architecture of the smaller building grew, as did the social history of people below gentry level, in the 1970s. And in this field, with works by Alec Clifton Taylor and R.W. Brunskill, who explored fairly rigorously the effects of geology and the narrow locality of materials, as well as neighbourhood styles and traditions, invariably through the systematic cataloguing of detailed observations in the field rather than archival research. So this evening I'd like to explore with you the common features and contrasts in the stock of smaller houses across the county's villages. I'm going to focus mainly on the period up to the start of the Great War in 1914, and will inevitably encounter the effects, usually benevolent, of local landowners on the living conditions of their tenants in the later 19th century, and the appearance of the villages that they owned. But I'd also like to consider the later expansion of these settlements, especially after 1945, and the effect of continuing development. So that you'll appreciate that in using the word vernacular, I'm not excluding that which is more consciously architect designed in the way we understand it today. And I'll do this generally in some fairly rapid individual village studies from across different parts of the county. One of the aspects of architecture of villages also worth reflecting on is the aesthetic appeal that they possess today, something that is made much of in the marketing of Dorset and other counties as a tourist destination. How many postcards have we seen of cottage views here and in the New Forest or in the Cotswolds perhaps? When you think of it, the cottage has a fairly limited range of types, and yet there's an interest in many streets that you feel could possibly be monotonous. Much of this has to do with the evolution over time, with replacement and rebuilding and refurbishment or infilling of plots. But a great deal of the impact of the whole has much to do with the lay of the land, whether flat or inclined, or the relation to the road, whether abutting it directly, which might safely be done in the house in the day of the horse and cart, or behind a pavement or elevated walkway, or in relation to plants and shrubs and climbers with which individual homeowners have chosen to decorate and enhance their homes. Because you must always remember that a cottage and a village house is a living thing, inhabited and surrounded by living things, not just a dollop of inert materials to be mathematically analysed. Housing density in a community is also significant in modifying the appeal of individual buildings or a whole street, or creating a distinctive atmosphere, and many villages differ widely. Oakford Fitzpaine, for example, has a very densely packed centre, as you can see from this old postcard, but it'll also be revealed in this aerial view. And to the right is another nearby village, Child Oakford, and you can see, those are modern aerial views obviously, but you can see how dense that is. Whereas Trent, a smaller village, is a settlement that is broadly dispersed along a single ribbon road with individual houses on much larger plots. The relationship not only to the road but to its garden, outbuildings and then to the surrounding landscape are all details that we might consider when we're wandering around a village. Many cottages stand on ground that gives directly to farmland or is adjacent to a farmyard. It's only in larger villages that you may get a square of road so that the houses back onto each other. But it's invariably at the back that extensions to accommodation are made. A roof line descending over a single-storey kitchen and scullery enlargement, and a wing almost doubling the size of the original accommodation. While many settlements have ancient, distant and quite genteel farmhouses, some, with their dairies, were an integral part of the main street, as we saw at Winfrith. But in my search for the core of old villages, I always looked for the church, the rectory, the manor house and the pub, or pubs, the faded multitude of which can still be spotted in names like White Lion Cottage or Cross Keys House. If we're bemused at the smallness of those, it's worth remembering that a public house often provided just a room in a cottage set aside for sociability, in a small community where alcohol, often made on the premises or very locally, could be bought, rather than the vast semi-industrial eateries that we've got used to today. Though it's interesting that we're returning to the cultural phenomenon of what we now call the Micro Brewery. A good number of settlements grew at significant junction points, and almost all have grown significantly in the last century and a quarter, and are still doing so. But it's usually easy to establish the edges of the old village, reverberating close to the local power base and its former shops, as they themselves are invariably memorialised in present-day names. How many old post offices I have stumbled across. In Hardy's day, a number of the places we consider large villages now were definitely regarded as towns. Puddletown, where his family came from, for example, and Cerne Abbas. But I will exclude few and even embrace the odd cottage in a place we now consider a town itself. Within each distinctive area and settlement, I'm going to organise the reflections in relation to patterns, materials and date. It's fairly obvious that the longest survivors are in the more enduring materials. Many survivals have been enlarged, altered or reinforced over time. As the very walls themselves, and particularly the side gable ends and the chimney stacks, provide documentation that might have been assigned to a paper archive with larger houses. And they merit more than a passing glance because the changes are quite interesting. I just like the way that house on the right there has just been doubled in size by the extension at the back and the raising of the roof. Now, I should warn you that this close staring at houses in a village is not without risk. I was in one mid-Dorset village early one morning and encountered the chair of the local neighbourhood watch out walking her dog. I explained why I was lingering rather inquisitively, and she told me very cheerfully that she'd had 3 phone calls about me already. To understand the general pattern of building clearly, though, we need to reflect on the geology and the soils of the county and what that means for local construction. That's quite a handily basic version. But I'm going to give you, or try to put, the effect of these different strata into words throughout the course of this talk. And if that was a little too simple for the advanced geologists amongst you, there's another one. However, let's put it this way. The most famous and probably the most serene and beautiful parts of the area are the flinty chalk downlands it shares with many southern counties, Wiltshire, Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, Surrey, Sussex and Kent. But those who know the coast well, and the way it presents its wave-sliced profiles at places like Lulworth and Kimmeridge, are well aware that the story is much more complex than that. We also share sandy heathland geology with the New Forest and rich agricultural valleys and plains, and areas, many areas, famous for their solid rock, which within the 60-mile diameter of Dorset shades very impressively from Portland's crisply white and carvable colours, which we've largely exported because it's very, very valuable building stone, to the creams and pale and even bluish greys of Purbeck, to the sage drab of the Shaftesbury Greensands, and a rich light ochre, as if someone had turned a pot of liquid honey into stone, from just over the border at Ham in Somerset. There's also in the north yellow Corallian limestone of our very own, and in the area north of Purbeck and around Poole Harbour, the brown ironstone or heathstone, of which you can find farm buildings entirely made on the road from Studland to Corfe. And you can find visible stratas of that if you walk on the inner edge of Poole Harbour, the opposite side of the beach at Studland. That stone speckles both the churches at Wool and Wimborne Minster, where a lighter variant constitutes a whole very early northern wall section. Because of its rich depth of colour, it was at times highly prized, with some varieties having a deep purple hue. Colour variation in building stone can be remarkable even between varying villages. Yet Minster, for example, is rather greyer in hue than Bradford Abbas, and this can be accounted for by the numerous very local quarries that provided materials. It's not stretching the point to say that at one time nearly every parish above a rocky substrate had its own quarry, and in the long past the warm seas and currents that helped form our limestones deposited and moved its constituent materials in various depths and varieties with extraordinary locality. Yet amongst all this too were sufficient beds of what's called London clay to support local brickmaking, which in common with other areas started on a small scale in the 17th century in providing for the sandier regions of the county. but increasing in dominance in areas such as Poole in the 18th, when brick became the most fashionable material. By the 19th century, the production of brick was more organised and industrial, centring on the towns of Gillingham with its bright red products, Broadmain with its brown speckled variety familiar in the Dorchester area, and Porstock Common, which in the 19th century benefited from a nearby railway line. The growth of the railways excuse me, inevitably affected the supply of non-local products, such as Welsh slate for roofing. But the character of locally based building demonstrates a very different attitude to materials than one we're used to in an age where transport is so easy. It made perfect sense always to use what was to hand. The flinty refuse of fields in the chalk areas, and chalk itself, either as blocks called cludge, usually used because of its fragility under some kind of protection or indoors, or as a kind of concrete called cob, a mixture of powdered lime and clay with a binder of chopped straw. And also the product of your almost certainly village quarry, so that no traveller should be surprised to descend into a local holloway bordered beneath the overhanging trees in sandy stone to emerge into a village of exactly the same material as you do on the roads to Bradford Abbas and Sadford Orcus. Regional stone is still highly esteemed for building, and it's not difficult to find quarries still supplying the industry in the area with some very fine online catalogues. Suttles and Lovels in Purbeck, for example, are two southern examples, while Harveys still continue to quarry at Ham Hill over at the Somerset border. However, there's very little absolute purity in the selection of materials in villages. Where a village may be dominantly flint and brick, you may also find flint and stone combinations. A village that is dominantly stone may have houses that are purely brick. It's difficult to draw a definite line where the exclusive use of certain ranges of materials begin and end. And this is particularly true in the Stour Valley, where the river provided a means of transport, although some suggest that a day's cart drive from the source might also be a practical limit for economical transportation. Materials are inevitably reused when a house was demolished and replaced. Anything serviceable was inevitably reincorporated into the new work for economy, and at times, I believe, also as a matter of law. In the Royal Commission of Historical Monuments record for the county, many references are made to materials being reused from the nearby reduction of monastic houses or the demolition of the vast mansion of Eastbury at Tarrant Gunville in 1782, which became a kind of easy quarry for local builders. There's a Manor Farm over at Ashmore, which has very clearly got some pieces bought or stolen from the old mansion. As a general rule, in a village, the grandest institutions monopolise the finest materials. Stone that might do for a barn was certainly going to be inferior to that which would serve for the church. That which served for a barn would be finer than the materials used for workers' cottages, but not as good as that commanded by the Manor Farm. The more important the house and prosperous the owner, the higher the level of shaping and finish of materials. Ashlar was best, squared and shaped, with a flat front surface from the most enduring of stone. But even then, it was rare that this quality was used on every facade of the house. The best is always kept for the front. Other walls might have less finely finished blocks of uneven sizes, or be constructed of rubble, random stones fitted together to make up a wall as a kind of local jigsaw. In the areas where flint is used in this county, it's usually bound and supported by stone or brick in bands and cornerstones. This practice is much more disciplined here than in Sussex, where much larger areas of flint walling are common, as are the buttresses and tie bars that had been necessary over the years to stop the whole thing falling to pieces. The cheapest material of all was cob, built up quite often without shuttering in layers, on a waterproof base, often of flint, and protected from rain by overhanging eaves and a waterproof plaster. Walls which had that funny little thatched ridge on them which you see in places, that is usually an indication that they're cob. In areas where timber framing was the basis of construction, and that's not everywhere in Dorset by any means, the interstices were often filled with cob or woven hazel wattles and various types of plaster, although as time went on, these were often replaced or faced with brick as it became cheaper. Now, while I've been surprised at the continuing prevalence of thatch in the county, even in new built areas in villages, about a quarter of the houses are often thatched. In the 19th century, except in areas where local stone could be conveniently split for tiling, it was almost universal and the cheapest option. It's difficult looking at a wheat field now to appreciate that in the 19th century and earlier, wheat was much, much taller. The length of the straw has been bred out, and the harvesting methods didn't damage it, so it could be used as an inexpensive roofing material. Now, the current state of some thatch around the county also suggests that we don't have nearly enough thatchers, and that as a result nowadays it's anything but a cheaper option. While a stone, slate or tile roof may be able to last without undue demands for maintenance for about 100 years, most thatched used locally will need serious attention after 40, if not as few as 25 years. Now it's time to illustrate all this with reference to particular cottages and ranges of houses, and I'm going to start with two of the most famous sets in the county. Those on Gold Hill in Shaftesbury make the point eloquently about the relationship between building, road and landscape. The stone-paved street, the steep fall, the magisterial views across the Blackmoor Vale, the descending ridges, all enhance the appearance of these very modest buildings from the early 18th century. Some, closest to the town hall behind us, are a little more recent than that and only 1 story tall. Opposite them is the retaining wall of the ancient Abbey Precincts. Now that thatched building down towards the bottom with a steeper roofline was actually modified after the Second World War, perhaps with a certain aesthetic self-consciousness. It had been turned back into thatch. Very often you get houses in Dorset villages that were thatched and then were turned to tiled roofs or corrugated iron roofs in some places. That one was a second reversion. Some of the houses have better symmetry than others. Some are constructed with much larger stone blocks. And of course, their windows have been replaced over time in different styles. Some with the large glass panes at the end of the 19th century, others reverting to the antique effects of rather smaller panes. All of these things add to the impact of this particular view. At the bottom of the hill, you will arrive on a level street with dwellings of no less historical interest. In fact, Shaftesbury is an exquisite collection of houses, both in its upper and lower levels, that merit a patient visit. Now, if it's the aesthetically self-conscious that you're after and the deliberate picturesque effect, you could probably do no worse than go to a village some 19 miles away, Milton Abbas. Again, once thought of as a town. The story's well known, of the removal of a settlement inconveniently close to a grand house to allow uninterrupted parkland for improvements. Yet the site of the new village, with its model houses, a gentle incline in a long valley, a subtly meandering road, is well chosen. The cottages themselves, very regular, form a measured procession with few interruptions either side of the street behind broad verges. There we see the classical mind of 1780 revealing itself. Until the late 1940s, great horse chestnuts stood between each of the houses on their broad plots. Yet they're deceptive. Each house is in fact 2. Behind the front door, a hallway lends to other front doors, left and right, which you might just be able to catch in the right-hand picture. And the numbering reveals this. But the impression intended originally was, surely, to give a sense of considerably greater prosperity and ease than more obviously semi-detached properties would suggest. The grass at the front is not subdivided. But they were built of cob, the very cheapest available material, albeit on sound flint and brick bases. All have wonderful but quite steeply inclined and winter-shaded gardens, and some have, of course, been merged by modern owners into one. Their occupants, naturally enough, are no longer estate workers and others dependent on the grand families of the Abbey house. And when I visited, a couple of the cottages were having renovations done by highly specialist builders because, of course, they're now governed by stringent listing and conservation orders. One thing that always mystified me was the presence in the village midway on the north side of the street of a 17th century almshouse dated 1674, one of a number that you can see around the county of a similar pattern, with the distinguishing central gabled hall and wings of accommodation. But this was in fact moved brick by brick from the old town near the Abbey house and reconstructed out of a sense of piety towards its founders and respect for history, unlike the more humble homes from that village which disappeared forever. It's probably one of the earliest examples of conscious architectural preservation in the country. I can't leave Milton Abbas without sharing, though, a later 19th century house which interrupts the succession of white boxes and demonstrates with its wonderful fleur-de-lis ridges, roof tile patterning and splendid Gothic-style barge boards at the front of the eaves the supreme quality and flourish of harmonious detail that Victorian builders could achieve. Let's keep heading south for our next exploration, where we might see what the lowlands offer us in the villages of Beer Regis and Puddletown. They lie in a long agricultural valley, bounded by poorer heathland to the south and west, and chalk downland to the north. Both have always been good-sized settlements, but the character of one has been significantly influenced through the interventions by the landowner, while the other has been left largely to its own devices. This view down the old Blandford Road into the village of Beer, with the profiles of thatched houses, has probably hardly changed in a century. And you will discover a place where pure brick building and a local disposition to rough rendering and painting of external walls is much more common than in other Dorset villages, as you can see from these examples. While elsewhere flint and brick combinations are displayed rather proudly, in Beer they're concealed as apparently unworthy. There remain a good many examples of thatch roofs too, while the traditional Dorset ridge, which is marked by criss-cross hazel staples and spars, and is not cut and shaped in any way, but forms an integral part of the whole. Here, among many attractive cottages and houses of various styles and ingenuity and extension, dating from the 16th to the 18th centuries, I could identify only one obvious estate house, that on the left, constructed by the Draxes in 1904, although there's a run of terraced houses with a very distinctive pattern of brickwork in North Street, and I haven't encountered that pattern very often elsewhere in Dorset. As with stonework elsewhere, the finer brick houses have a frontage which is of superior quality brick to the side gable ends. And with lesser houses, if you go to Beer, you'll see the patching and alteration is crude and haphazard and very visible. And we can also find an example here at the Cedars in bottom right of some rather individual glazing bars which adds distinction to an otherwise quite plain rendered building of the early 19th century. Now the old centre of Puddletown just down the road focused on the church and is not quite so linear in plan, with a green and a market square approached by curving and angled roads to the south of the main highway. Here we find the oldest of the buildings, Tudor Cottage, on the right, showing a boldness in the importation of stone from a distance interspersed with courses of flint in a very attractive combination. You can find examples of similar styles elsewhere, both in Oakford Fitzpaine and Winterbourne Stickland. The four-light mullioned windows on the ground floor and the door are a good indicator of age. This is a 16th century building dominantly. Such windows are common to the 16th and 17th century. And as they're in a smaller house, they're more likely to persist as fashion changed, and less likely to be hacked out and expensively replaced. The rather crisper upper windows perhaps suggest some sensitive 19th century restoration. Cottages and houses under thatch in Puddletown are predominantly rather taller, with window frames achieving almost full height and more within the wall space, rather than having the thatch descend around them on either side as a dormer, giving an air of lofty consequence to the central area. And while no shops remain here, evidence of them is still very elegantly visible in various windows. And yet, the character of Puddletown was transformed by the building programme of the 19th century owners of the Islington House estate, the Brymer family, along the main Dorchester Road. A large school and a public reading room indicate the importance attached to educational opportunities for people of all ages as a community activity. It's easy to imagine the airy schoolrooms in this building and to note the generous accommodation attached to the left. There are also rows of cottages and houses of slightly austere appearance in mellow brick, in some cases, or limestone, as here, sometimes dressed with hamstone. Or elsewhere in the village in a slightly rough block style, which is a little forbidding, but found elsewhere in the county in the north. There was no doubt in the minds of those who undertook this task that no matter how lowly you might be, you deserved a home that was well designed and built in the finest materials and spacious too, a lesson some of our more modern developers seem entirely to have forgotten. The solid quality was still evident when the Brymers were building this run of cottages just before the Great War. If for a moment we jump further south across the Piddle Valley and the Heath, Wool boasts another collection of thatched cottages huddling close to its church, although much of the modern development of the town again has taken place parallel to a road and the railway line to the west. This area also boasts a cottage ornée, or should one say cottage ornée, anyway, in the John Nash style from around 1820, and an interesting pair of homes with names from the modern fanciful to the older brutally honest. Midden, I'm delighted to say, is a dung heap. I think I could probably also write another paper on the names of English cottages and their relative tweeness. So anyway, I won't make any further comment on Gingerbread Cottage. I hope there are a few bears in there. Anyway, but the thing that interested me was that in this village there's a prevalence again of the brown heath stone in the mix of building materials. It's found in the church, it's found in a farm in the bottom middle there, and a substantial house, and throughout other older parts of the settlement. It gives a rather nice warm checker effect. Now, although over their existence houses inevitably have had their windows changed multiple times if they're a couple of hundred years old, one feature you do notice in this part of the country that still remains, and you tend not to, it doesn't strike you, it's quite rare, but it's you'll see this, it's the sideways sliding windows. They're not casements. And they seem to owe something to the very early first types of windows, which were coverings for openings before glass was ever used, where you just had wooden boards that you slid backwards and forwards in front of a frame. Now, they've been replaced in huge numbers of houses, but they persist locally. And that persistence suggested to me something of the poverty of the area in the 19th century. Things that don't change with fashion as quickly as you'd expect reflect a lack of income quite often. Now, we've noticed elsewhere already the casement or side hinged openings with mullioned windows in Tudor Cottage at Puddletown, usually metal framed with leaded lights, which in themselves are testimony to the small size of glass in the early days of its manufacture. As time went on, the crown glass that was made enabled squarer, larger panes to be used in windows, and eventually you got enormous sheets of industrially produced plate glass. Now's the time to note the upward sliding sash. Now this, unlike the sideways sliding York windows, required counterweights and boxes and was an altogether more sophisticated and scientific and expensive design than its horizontal cousin. It was much favoured in the 18th century and afterwards. But you'll also notice in the farm on the right the arrival of larger paned windows in the 19th century, which brought additional light and broader views, but sometimes lends buildings a rather blank and startled, staring appearance. Like the Isle of Portland, the Isle of Purbeck has long been famous for its quars or quarries, and this close availability of very fine material significantly influenced its buildings, and the frequency of stone roofs also. Throughout the old town of Corfe, which in the good old days returned 2 members of Parliament itself, the effect of the dominance of stone is one of both harmony and solidity, as you can see here in the central and oldest pub, the Greyhound, which itself is formed of 2 17th century houses. The porch to the left is an 18th century addition. The courses of the stone in local roofs are usually arranged in diminishing sizes, giving an appearance of lightness as it rises in a deliberate distortion of perspective. The side streets at Corfe are also interspersed with thatched dwellings, and the main one has its own beautifully symmetrical manor house from 1600, as well as houses constructed in the 18th, still marked as belonging to the Banks estate by its familiar oxblood paint. Wherever you see that, it means it's a Banks estate house. The Digbys near Sherburn used to have a rather sickly light brown on all their properties. Not far away at Church Knoll, and again in the Langtons, the Matravers villages, you get a very, very similar architectural type. The street, actually, at Church Knoll boasts another reading room, this one a little more modest than at Puddletown, from 1847. And yet another pub, which is an amalgam of 2 buildings. The left-hand cottage here, having had its first floor removed to form a single taller room. But if you go there, it gives you a pretty good idea of the low headroom of the upper part of such cottages. I grew up in one, and I could only stand in my bedroom at my full height in the central area that was about sort of 10 foot square. That the eaves meant I used to have to crouch around in other parts of it. While in many parts of the county thatch is poured rather gently and softly over the dormers, there is a tendency in Purbeck for it to be moulded rather more sharply against the windows, and having windows themselves that are rather less squat and stand more boldly up from the ground floor walls. This is particularly true both at Lulworth and at Kimmeridge, where the hand of the owner of the Smedmore estate can be seen in ensuring brighter housing for the local tenantry in a range of cottages here, almost uniformly thatched. One rarity to be found at Kimmeridge too is this row of buildings that look as if someone has stolen a part of Yorkshire. They're miners' cottages. This is one row of 3 that were projected for those hired to mine shale from the seams there. In the end, that proved uneconomical, and only 1 row was built. In one of the less well-maintained houses, you can see one of the old sideways sliding York windows. Now, if we go to the extreme west of the county on the Somerset and Devon borders, there's another character altogether. the place feels more impenetrable and quiet, with its narrow winding lanes and plunging hills. Furthest west is Thorncombe, where the building material is of a greyish stone, often mixed in with large flints, and dressed at the corners and at windows and doors with brick, although there's a fashion here for painting it. It has, in the middle of the village, an old manor farm at right angles to the road, in the same materials, an attractive run of 19th century cottages, and down beneath the peak of the hill, where they're mostly confined, a range of thatched homes, as well as a former school, now the village hall. All this in a parish centred on a relatively small settlement, but that parish contained two very grand houses indeed, Ford Abbey and Sadborough, their owners commemorated in the one church. The abbot of Ford Abbey was clever enough to make himself appointed the first vicar of the parish church in the village there. Not far away, around Bedminster, I always used to call it, I'm told I should say Bedminster, you will find the most golden of the Dorset villages, amongst which Stoke Abbot must count as one of the most radiant in its warm little valley. Even the farms on the approach to it can't boast the same richness of colour of the village houses and the runs of thatched cottages, where we also note the characteristic corner houses, the 17th century farmhouse buildings, an 18th century gentleman's residence, vigorously resisting the sash window and looking backwards in fashion, even in the addition of its later front porch. There's a nonconformist chapel, now, as in most Dorset villages, converted to housing, but once it represented a kind of worship and place of worship which working people felt much more at home in than in the parish church, overlooked by the parson and the lord of the manor in their elevated superior pews. Nonconformity too went hand in hand with a questioning political radicalism, a social as well as religious dissent from the inherited and unbalanced order. We must never forget that the trade union movement began amongst agricultural workers in what was then one of the poorest counties in the land. And that in the northern part of the county there were riots in agitation for electoral reform in places now as sleepily self-satisfied as Sherborne. There's one other feature that I'd like to draw your attention to in this village, and that is the crisp angular gable on the right here, around tall first floor windows at the front of buildings. It's very much a deliberate distinguishing mark of contrast to the lower style of construction from the 17th century, and a reaction to the austere and unrelieved high frontages that you can see in the 18th. And you come across this boast of spacious airiness in the Victorian buildings of many villages, and particularly estate houses, from as far afield as Evershot on the left and Long Critchell on the right. It's the vernacular response to Gothic revival in much larger and more formal buildings. It's genuine wooden ancientness you're after. There's only one place to go, and that is Church Street at Cerne Abbas, where a run of late 15th century houses remains, some looking remarkably original, many in various states of relative modernisation, by which I mean 18th century, although the deposition of the overhanging upper storey persists, as you can see all the way along the street. Cerne being in its day a very prosperous place, you'll find smart 18th century homes of brick. But many of the buildings betray in the pattern of their materials their history and significance, as you see in this old cottage and the old inns. The Royal Oak belongs to the early 1500s. The New Inn, if you look at the photograph of it in the Royal Commission volumes from the 1950s, originally seemed to have had a kind of rendering over the front of it. But our style now is to enjoy the full, unembarrassed historical mess that the patching and evolution of the building presents us with. You'll also notice that the arch above the carriageway has that very characteristic flat curve, which belongs to the 19th century. So that's a bit of late infilling there comparing to the rest. And you can see that some windows have maintained their mullions, as on the left, and others at the bottom have been replaced with sash windows. There's another old inn, which has a lot of plain chalk and flint together, the clunch in the upper story. I think this is the old Bell Inn. Those materials, along with the hamstone windows, all those details were borrowed by the Victorian designers of this courthouse and town jail. So they've done what modern architects do. They borrow the local styles and they make something of their own of it. Now, the golden stone you see there around the windows is to be found again and again in the area around Sherborne, sometimes purely itself, sometimes as dressing for greyer material. This is true of the village of Yetminster, which has a very fine centre of well-preserved older buildings, as do both Thornford and Bradford Abbas. Perhaps two of the most interesting buildings in Yetminster will serve as an introduction to the place. There's this old school, a foundation by a very distinguished fellow of the Royal Society. It's now a coffee shop and a village store, but the educational endowment still exists and supports local students in their sixth form studies in nearby towns. And you'll come across advertisements to apply to the fund in the village hall and in the local pub. There's another old building, this farm, Upbury, which has elements dating back to the 1400s. It had upper stories inserted during its lifetime. But that also has an interesting association with national scientific history. In Yetminster, there's a very good range of substantial buildings and cottages.
Could you just read that plaque?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Farmer and pioneer vaccinator against smallpox, Benjamin Jesty, lived here. And the other one was Robert Boyle, FRS. And that school building dates from around 1711. And there was a school on that site until 1945. So the Butler Education Act did for it. But I mean, there was another school within reasonable distance. So we got a good range of 17th century buildings and cottages, and also others belonging to the 18th century and early 19th. The 19th century also saw a larger school flourish before it too became a private house. Thornford's got its own school of a rather more predictable pattern from the 19th century. This one furnished for the village by the Digbys of Sherborne Castle in 1862, and there are neatly gabled estate houses in the High Street. But throughout the village you again find houses from the 17th and 18th centuries. The style of containing the thatch in this area between raised and capped gable ends is fairly prevalent, and may be indicative of a greater distinction in the houses to which they belong. Now, both in Nether Compton and Trent, just to the north of the A30, you will come across villages with examples of more golden hued stone, and then rather different scale and style. Both villages have fine examples of 17th century houses and farmsteads of substantial size, as you can see here. And they're very conveniently dated. In the 17th century, they were very keen in leaving dates on the outside of buildings. And again in the 19th, the 18th century, that tended to fade quite a bit. I don't quite know why. And in Trent, there are beautiful ecclesiastical and large domestic buildings. From the late 15th century chantry, just in the grounds, on the edge of the grounds of the church, and a rectory. I haven't shown you many rectories, but the one on the left at Trent is worth a glance at because of its loftiness. And there is also a nice, delicate 19th century set of almshouses. There is also a tranquil home built in a U shape around a front courtyard garden, which I think features in John Cooper Powys's book Wolf Solent. Trent has an unusually large number of substantial 17th century houses on significant plots, very well spaced out, which give it a very distinctive air. Nether Compton, by contrast, is tiny, but it boasts the old farm we've seen, these wonderful rambling houses, once more a disciplined Regency home. They were fond of a very individual glazing vase in those days, an early school in battlemented Gothic from 1847, serving both that village and the one up the hill over Compton. Nether obviously means lower, so you've got the two villages together, and solid and smart estate buildings from the late 19th century. This rather nice combination is from sort of 1885, I think. By contrast, Marnhold, not far from Shaftesbury in the northwestern part of the Blackmore Vale, with its own quarries, is a very substantial settlement, significantly enlarged in the 19th century, and it has layers of development in its ribbons of roads stretching out from the church. Close observation of them will confirm that there are in fact three separate older hamlets run together. Next door to St Gregory's is an ancient farm building, very reminiscent and in similar style to Trent's Chantry, and it's of an almost identical date. But it also reveals the rather startling evidence of the 18th century's contempt for Gothic architecture. Along the church road you'll find the surviving cottages and houses from the 17th and the 18th century, with which we're by now very familiar, but also in Marnell, genteel Victorian villas in Italianate style. While on the other branch of the village, with its settlements northwards, you'll encounter former farm sites transformed into 19th century gentlemen's residences, and here at Tapsay's house, with its slightly Frenchified garden facade, or built from scratch, as you see in this rather forbidding elevation of the lodge from the 1890s. The Victorians also gave the village small villas and a little terrace with their large paned windows, favouring the rather bulky rough profile stone, which feels as if it belongs in the Highlands rather than the softer Dorset. In this part of the substantial village you can inevitably find both the Congregational and the Methodist chapels, but also evidence of a Quaker community in a reading room and lecture hall provided by the Society of Friends. The violation and clash of scale of the Victorian intrusions is perhaps pretty well illustrated by this contrast between a row of commercial premises and the remaining cottages that link with them. Now, the sources of the limestone with which Marnell is almost entirely built do not lie very far beneath the surface of the local fields. But we don't have to travel very far east to find ourselves in the country of a different kind of stone altogether, greensand, a stone that dominates in the hilltop buildings of Shaftesbury and local villages here as at Ashmore, though it's also to be found regularly heading south from there on the road to Blandford Forum. And as you head south, you notice that the prevalence of green sand fades all the way down to from Melbury Abbas to Ewan Minster. It's also noticeable that the houses in the northern part of the county have much more in common with the design of those over the Wiltshire border, being rather loftier and longer, and often constructed with significantly larger blocks of stone, sometimes intermixed very squarely with flint, as we've seen, and at other times with brick. But it's in the adjacent farmland hills of the Stour Valley that we find the most regular use of flint and brick combinations, especially in villages like Winterbourne Stickland. You'll also find it at Shillingstone, Child Oakford and Oakford Fitzpaine, amongst many others, although in these villages pure brick is also favoured, and you'll find this mixed with stone as well as flint. And there are also a number of timber-framed cottages still very well preserved across them. Now, while there are rendered and cob cottages under thatch in Stickland, it has a range of buildings reliant on pure brick and flint from a number of eras. While this farmhouse, which also that was just an example of that range, and at the bottom there, that's the hamstone and flint banding that you also saw at Puddletown and you find in Oakford Fitzbane. We've also got this farmhouse, which demonstrates a whole range of materials from stone to brick and flint and to cob on the extension then, the upper part of that sort of lean-to, as it were. You'll also find in the village these long rows of cottages that belong to the 18th century and later, and a range of estate houses with their engaging detailing in the woodwork and a very fine village school. Unique among the designs are these cottages with their banded brick compartments under a steep thatch roof set completely above the window line, dating probably from the later 18th century, giving a very lofty appearance. Now, the attractiveness of this combination of materials in disciplined form, in contrast to the slightly heterogeneous patterns in some parts of the Stour Valley, is demonstrated in this beautifully balanced France farm in the parish of De Weston. You can see it on the Blandford bypass. It's a 19th century building, but one of the purest expressions of that kind of local farm architecture. Now, in a society in which home ownership has been ingrained into our mentality, we do need to pinch ourselves and recall that in the past the norm was rental, and rental at fairly affordable rates. Part of the benign paternalism of English landowners was their interest in reinvesting in their estates as part of a project of constant improvement and increasing value. Estate owners always earmarked a certain percentage of the income from their estate for architectural improvement. It was only idiots like Mr. Brooke in George Eliot's Middlemarch who were completely indifferent to the appeal of modern houses. And there were, of course, benefits, if you're a landowner, in the improvements of health and well-being of the tenants who worked for you. Obviously, as well, there are always other people who owned parcels of land in villages and who let some houses that they possessed. Now, these 19th century estate houses are often very fine in design, as we've seen in Puddletown. But sometimes they feel slightly harsh in their choices of durable materials. Landowners built for posterity. They didn't build temporarily. They went for the best materials and buildings that they hoped would last hundreds of years. And so they tended to buy and import long-lasting bricks that lacked the immediate mellowness of other more familiar local materials. Perhaps the best known of these types of housing locally are the yellow brick Lady Wimborne cottages from the 1870s and later, relating to the Canford estate, which not only express benevolence but also ownership. Now, 108 of these have been identified as still existing. They're found in their greatest concentration, unsurprisingly, just west of Canford along Oakley Lane. But you'll also encounter the Canford estate style at Longham, and examples of the cottages as far afield as Lilliput on Sandbanks Road, and Hamworthy and Corfe Mullen. Once again, attention to relieving detail is clear from the form of the doors to the porches, the chimneys and the roof and ridge tiling. In the main street of Canford Magna near the house, the same style is also seen, but in softer, rather higher quality materials, and in gabled terraces to produce a more deliberately villagey effect. Now, the Banks estate, with even greater reach overall, erected these interesting specimens in the late 19th century on the old Roman road down to Shapwick from Badbury Rings. The chosen form, again, as at Milton, seeking to disguise the number of cottages that they contain. That building has 3. But again, under a design where detail and quality mattered. Elsewhere, in case you were in any doubt that the subtle gradation of social hierarchy extended to estate workers as well as their masters, I draw your attention to this collection of early 20th century buildings down by the kitchen gardens at Kingston Lacey, where the head gardener's importance was signalled to all by this house, and the relative humility of his co-workers, as we would say these days, by these attached cottages. That's not to say that there was not already a stock of solid, considerably older housing in the Pampill area, which also boasts the almshouse that we have seen earlier on at the very beginning of the talk. Down on the estate at Bryanston, there's a very small village around the home farm of red brick. But higher up the road, as you start the climb to the downland, you will come across a range of crisp and practical houses in rather more orange tones with very flat surfaces, relieved by patterns of blue engineer's brick, materials designed to be impervious to weather and to time. At Ewan, the estate buildings are also dominantly of a harder brick, but here they're dressed in hamstone for relief, producing a very warm effect. The patterns of balanced gables and pleasing symmetry are something they all seem to have in common. Now, on my tours, I've also seen plenty of more modern buildings. After 1945, local authorities took on greater responsibility for what we now call social housing, and most villages have their share of utilitarian council houses, well designed and on good plots, often dispersed around pleasant cul-de-sacs, although economically constructed, as sometimes the poor quality of the bricks, as you can see bottom right, reveal. However, the more I saw, the more I came to admire the comparative spaciousness and generosity of those homes and their gardens. It was, though, the 1970s and 80s that did the greatest violence aesthetically to villages, with bland houses and bungalows where the well-meaning but essentially ugly use of reconstituted stone in patterns that look more like paving than walling pepper the outer edges with a depressing frequency, or intrude sadly where they've replaced decayed older buildings. I'm not doubting their comfort and pleasantness as a place to live in, but they do clash rather with things as ancient as the edges of a Dorset village. Now, while aspects of Poundbury may justifiably be compared to the architectural eccentricities of another Prince of Wales, the commitment of the Duchy of Cornwall and Poundbury, and Prince Charles himself, to vernacular and traditional styles of building has been an undoubted force for good in influencing planners. There's hardly a village I visited that has not had some significant extension in the last 20 to 25 years. And if I show you a range of illustrations from across the county, you'll recognise at once the styles and architectural vocabulary to which they are referring and from which they are borrowing and adapting, sometimes a little timidly, perhaps.
So these are new?
These are all new. These are all houses built in the last 25 years. And sometimes a little more boldly. Now, while from an aesthetic point of view, I think it would appear that the Dorset village seems to have a more secure future, it's less certain whether this is equally true of its social prospects. Much building and restoration continues to satisfy the demand for a share in a commutable rural dream, or a place of vacation, or retirement, with all that means for house pricing locally, for the changing social profile of settlements and demands for public services. There can be less confidence that recent planning has sufficiently addressed the deficit of affordable but attractive housing that the next generations of rural residents have a right to, as was true of the post-war period. We have in this county a wonderfully rich range of villages, almost every one of which represents the enduring in local house design, over at least the last 450 years. From observation, it would appear that the vast majority of this housing stock is in exceptionally good condition. It would be wonderful if participating in the future of these places were guaranteed to all, and not just an increasingly dominant and sometimes carelessly intrusive middle class. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, John, that was an absolute feast. The only problem with that talk is that I'm now suffering from acute house envy, because there are at least a dozen of those houses that I really would like to... some of those gentlemen's residences, I think, would suit us down to the ground, don't you think?
I'm quite happy where we are.
David, I actually lived in one of those.
Did you?
I rented it when I was very young.
So you spotted one that you actually lived in?
Yeah, the last one in Shillingstone, the Tarry one, my
Yes.
friend had just moved out of.
Yeah, yeah.
But the Comfort Mag was a lovely place
Yeah,
to
yeah,
live.
fantastic.
It was that one that looked like the Taj Mahal, wasn't it? It was that one.
Oh, the Taj Mahal. Yes, yeah, yeah.
I didn't live in that one. Just strange to see a house you lived in at the...
Well, you can see that an immense amount of work has gone into this talk, and it was specially commissioned, this talk, by Simon for Dorset Humanists. So, I mean, I did get the chance to go on some of the jaunts into Dorset, but I had no idea really what John was up to. I mean, I just went on the jaunt, sat in the car, had a bit of a snooze, read a book, and John just bounced around with his camera, and I had no idea really what was emerging. And you know, if I can let you into a secret, he has been sort of panicking a little bit in the last few weeks about just the sheer amount of material that he gathered over those jaunts over the past few months. But it's a fantastic result, John. Well done. Thank you. Well, you have light. Yes, we could just put some light on, couldn't we? Let me just go and see. I won't put all of them on. It's a bit of a shock. Let's see what we can do.
Flashbang.
Let there be light. Should we pray?
Has it had a bit of a huff because we turned them on?
Yeah, put 50p in the meter, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Well, that is, okay, well, I mean, I don't know if there are any questions bubbling up. Daniel, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, that was a very enjoyable talk. You have a wonderful way of describing the subject. I was wondering, you did mention there was one house in a John Nash style. We were on that slide quite briefly. I was wondering what a John Nash style is, and is it related to the mathematician John Nash?
I don't think John Nash was a mathematician as well as architect.
Well, there was one.
He was,
20th century one, wasn't he?
Yeah, but he came up with game theory, which is.
I mean, he was early 18th to early 19th century.
Okay, so it wouldn't be this one.
Yeah. So he's the man who. I mean, he designed obviously the Brighton Pavilion and Buckingham. The bit of Buckingham Palace that's behind the ugly bit at the front. And the Marble Arch, of course, which was the gateway to Buckingham Palace before it was moved. What else would people know from... But he also developed a whole vocabulary of gentlemen's, kind of enlarged cottages. He did quite a lot down in Devon, and there's a whole village called Blaze Hamlet, which was a kind of model village of these houses that he developed a kind of cottagey style for, and they were characteristic with those sort of rather soft thatch roofs, little turrets, bullseye windows, verandas, that kind of thing, usually in white stucco. So, but I'm sorry he wasn't your mathematician.
Aaron?
So given £1 million, I presume you'd like to live in a cottage. But my experience of cottages being low ceilings, cold, windows need replacing, the heating's gone, the roof needs replacing. I would much sooner have a brand new built place with those lovely IKEA furnitures that I know you hate.
I mean, I grew up in a cottage, and the ceilings were very low. we used to dread the telephone going, because Dad used to run to the phone and forget that there was a 300-year-old solid oak beam about that when he was a bit taller than me. And sometimes you'd hear this, you'd hear the phone go, you'd hear Dad's feet, you'd hear bugger, flop as he fell backwards, and then he would go and pick up the phone and try not, to make sense of things while he was seeing stars. But yeah, they had their inconveniences, and our bedrooms upstairs all led into one another. And to get into my bedroom, there was a beam up to there. My bedroom door was in the edge. So to get into my bedroom, I had to tiptoe through my sister's room, open the door, and go in like that. And this area was the only bit I could actually stand up in my full height. So I kind of appreciate the problems of cottages, but they do have a certain charm. And of course, everyone's shoved a bathroom on the back and things like that. And they're much nicer than the front usually than they do the back, where they've been, modern things have been added and cobbled together. Yeah.
Can I have a follow-up, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, you're allowed to follow up.
As it's the COP26 week, how are these houses with the carbon footprint?
I should imagine they're, well,
does the stone make them solid, or does the roof make them leaky in the windows?
I'm not an expert on building types, but I mean, some of them have got incredibly thick walls.
Yeah.
There's little space for insulation because they're not cavity walls with two skins. I would imagine a thatch roof was always really good for keeping you warm in the winter and cool in the summer.
Okay.
Because you didn't get the heat directly on material.
Yeah.
The sort of straw, the depth of, the deep straw, and again it worked wonderfully as insulation in the winter.
Okay.
The dripping of rain from a thatch roof sometimes could get to you. You've probably noticed, I have seen it in a couple of places, but generally thatched houses don't have gutters of any kind, and the ground is rendered and sloped away from the building, so you're not undermining your foundations. But you get this constant pitter-patter for an hour after the rain has come and gone, and it's slightly melancholy. But otherwise, I mean, they're very valuable as kind of insulation. And again, windows is another problem. Lots of cottages are spoilt by not very good windows. There was someone on the radio the other day who lived in Brighton and said they wanted to sort their house out and get a grade A sort of listing, because you have to tell people what your insulation level is when you sell a house now. And they said it was too expensive for them to do anything because they're in a conservation area, and we've just had this problem, even in that house in 1908, replacing windows. Although everybody in the street has replaced their windows as willy-nilly, new regulations meant that we had to put matching sash windows, double glazing in, and that's probably twice the price of ordinary double glazing. So, yeah. So I think probably not very good as far as their footprint is concerned. I would have thought about.
Do you want to say where your cottage was, the one you grew up in?
Oh yeah, it's in the New Forest, in the village. It was on the village green at Berkeley, and yeah, it's been knocked about a bit since then. Yeah.
Any other question? Yeah, Kathy.
Was there no comment? Two comments, if I may. I lived in a Cotswold cottage, and actually, because it was so small and we had such thick walls, and we didn't have any heating, and my parents lived off the land, we tried to. But when we was on the sitting room, it was so warm because it was so, the walls were so thick. We had really very deep window seats. Well, I thought it was insulated. Yeah. What I was going to ask, I very much enjoyed that. I couldn't keep up my little brain, and I thought we'd almost request that you do another talk based on, say, 2 villages.
Yeah.
You just go slowly through the houses from the oldest to the newest, and I would find that be really interesting to see.
Okay, I'll ask the chairman if he can. I'll have to have a word with the programme advisor on that one. Yeah, okay, we've got a few, but Steve first, yeah?
Okay. Would you say all of the villages grew up around farming communities and landowners, and would you know anything about the names of the villages and stuff? They all sound obviously very Dorset. You can hear one of these names and you know it's from Dorset straight away. So.
Usually, I mean, it was very rare for me not to be able to identify a local manor, either by stumbling across it or seeing it on the map. So that they were almost invariably, I mean, the social dynamic was a manorial house or manor farm, and then the landowners owned nearly all of the village. Some of the places are very grand, like Melbury Sanford, which was a big house at the very beginning. That belongs to the Earl of Ilchester, and they own huge tracts there. The Draxes own vast areas. The Digbys, who are the people that the Lulworth area, the Wells. There are about half a dozen families who own huge amounts of Dorset. Now, village names, some of the names go back to early medieval ownership. And you kind of notice that there are commonalities. So there's Bryanston and Hazelbury Bryan, and I think again there's a common land ownership there. And when you get the subdivisions of names, like there's Child Oakford and Oakford Fitzpaine. Names like Fitzpaine are usually family connections. Others, I mean, relate to geographical features and things like that. Some are Latin.
Rhyme intrinsica.
Rhyme intrinsica means rhyme within the borders of the Abbey ownership lands from Sherborne. Toller Porcorum of the pigs. So we see lots of wild pigs around Toller Porcorum. Yeah, I mean, that's another talk.
Sally.
I was just wondering, you mentioned, going back to medieval times, is there any building anywhere in Dorset that is wattle and daub? Goes back as far as that?
I don't know.
You obviously didn't come upon any in your wanderings around the villages anyway.
I mean, cob is the crudest, it's the oldest material.
Yes.
And again, that's often faced. Nowadays, as bricks became cheap and people recognised it was not a very durable material, they faced it. I don't know. I can't help with that, I'm afraid.
Simon.
In a few of the pictures you show what I know of as crinkly tiles.
Yes.
Can you talk about them and why they appear to be very much a product of Somerset and some parts of Yorkshire?
Yeah, Somerset, Wiltshire. Yes, they're the very, very flat clay tiles, aren't they? With that little ridge at the overlap.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know why they're particularly. I mean, it's probably just a tradition of local manufacture. The interesting thing about Gold Hill is you've got all those the small clay tiles, the sort of almost handmade ones. I mean, it may be that they're of industrial manufacture. They look more industrial. They look like pressed clay, rather than done at a smaller scale in a local works. I can't tell you why. Where else do you get them? You get them in East Anglia as well. So it's quite broad, that the distribution, which suggests they may be from an industrial manufacturer. And although you come across them in 17th century properties over time get re-roofed, and very often properties were dethatched, in the late 19th century. particularly substantial houses where people felt that the thatch was perhaps. You know, we have a very sentimental attachment to thatch, but to a good number of people, thatch must have appeared cheap and nasty. And if you were grand, you'd probably rather have stone or tile on your roof. And very often what happened, once thatch came off, people tended then to raise their upper story by about a foot to 18 inches, I've noticed. So that you had probably better headroom in the upper stories. But I suspect they were more industrially produced than the others. That's the only answer I can give.
John, do people go for thatch now really for aesthetic reasons rather than utilitarian reasons or practical reasons? I mean, obviously it sounds like a much more expensive option these days.
Yes. I mean, I think so. I mean, it's a nice mix. What they do is they try and imitate the old village style. When you get a new cul-de-sac or estate on the edge of a Dorset village, you will get a mixture of roof types and thatches included. Most of the thatch that we get now is actually imported from Eastern Europe. There isn't sufficient reed to supply our local needs. The manufacturers have kind of dropped down. And of course planners and planning authorities have lots of squabbles with thatched house owners because one kind of reed that we do grow a lot of in this country is Norfolk reed, and it's much more durable than the reed that comes in from abroad. A Norfolk reed thatch can last 100 years if it's well maintained, but it looks different to the other kinds of reed, or what's called combed wheat reed as well. And the local and planning authorities sometimes refuse to give people permission to rethatch a house in Norfolk reed if it's not the indigenous type of material used in that village.
And yet they'll import it from Eastern Europe.
Yes, but it's the same kind of reed you would get in a river estuary, sort of around the south of England. So yeah, it's awkward. And obviously, the insurance on thatch is extraordinary. I mean, we have some friends who have a nice thatched house in Winterbourne, Kingston, but they had to promise, so that they could get a reasonable insurance cover for their house, they had to promise never to light a fire in their fireplace, which, you know, rather defeats the point of having a cottage, it seems to me. But you can understand, well, yes, you can understand that.
Okay, Phil next, and then I'll get back to Dan and Aaron again. Yeah.
John, do you know anything about that thatched castle out the other side of Morton?
Oh,
Woodford Castle.
Woodford Castle.
Because I've passed it lots of times.
No, well, I mean, I have read about it, but I can't remember what I read. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
It is 14th, parts of it are 14th century.
It looks quite
I think.
old, yeah.
And again, but I also think there's a certain amount of Victorian restoration there. But it is, I think it belongs to the Landmark Trust now, and I think you can hire it
so I believe,
for a holiday stay. Yeah, I expect you're probably not allowed to smoke a cigarette inside. No, I mean, it's always fascinating me. I always thought it's a lovely house to come across as you're just. You turn into a straight stretch of road and it's there beside you. Yeah, it is rather magical.
Daniel.
Yes, I was wondering, is there a reason why thatched cottages are often so short? Why didn't they make them taller? Is it something to do with the thatch being too heavy to be supported too high up by the stone or something?
No, I mean thatch is one of the lightest materials you can have, and in fact, sometimes when people converted from thatch to tile, they had to redo the whole roof because the spars that you would use underneath thatch were much less substantial than you would have certainly underneath a stone roof or a tile roof. So why were they so squat? Very good question. you know, I mean, people often say, "Oh, people were shorter in those days." Well, they probably were, but not that much. And as you went up, building materials became lighter and cheaper. So quite often you'd have a stone and a brick and stone base on your ground floor, and as you went up, you might go to cob, or you might just have wood with infilling, so you get lighter, less durable materials. I'm presuming it might have been something to do with insulation and warmth as well, having the roof. But I think the thing is, the status of the bedrooms probably changed, I suspect. We see bedrooms as having an importance in the social dimension of a house as a site of privacy, whereas I think a bedroom was simply a place where you bunged as many of your children as possible to get to sleep. And
in the same bed.
Yes, probably in the same bed. And worrying about headroom was probably less of a concern, as people wouldn't spend a lot of time there. I don't know. I suspect that may have something to do with it.
Thank you.
Aaron?
Yes, my question was on height as well. It seemed most of the cottages were 2 stories.
Yeah.
Is that a cost thing? Because obviously they could build high, because they could build cathedrals and churches, but for domestic dwellings it seems to be just 2 stories majority.
Yes, I mean, some of the houses in Puddletown around the square, there were 3 stories. 19th century houses often had an attic story or attic space. But I also think it was their sense of what the materials would take.
Right.
And the higher up you go, the more weight you've got. I think they kind of trusted their local designs. And the other thing is, you tend to go up when land prices are high. You know, in London, that's where you get those, you know, those 5-story places in Pimlico with a basement and, you know, attics. So you can spread. There are a lot of long buildings if you need that, or you put an L-shaped extension at the back if the family got huge. But I was also aware of the fact there's. Have any of you been to that Downland Open Air Museum near West Dean, near Chichester? And they've got all those houses. And the thing that struck me going around that was people lived outside as much as they possibly could. You know, we are obsessed with the interior nature of our houses, and we don't think of, on a slightly cool day, of spending all your time doing things outside. If you have a railwayman's cottage and 5 children or more, you're encouraging people to live out of doors. So again, it's a different way of thinking about the way people existed. And we're not so hardy. The idea of saying to your 7 children, you know, after breakfast, right, off you go out into the countryside, and we'll see you at tea time, and go as far as you want, do what you like, but just look after little Johnny. You know, I mean, it's a completely different mindset, and that affects the way houses are developed and the manner in which families lived within them, I think.
Sally?
Yeah, just following up on that, a lot of it was the lighting thing, wasn't it? If you wanted light for the, you know, if you were doing cottage industry working at home, I don't know what was the case with the Dorset button makers, but I mean, lace making, for instance, you have these even old photographs, but also old drawings, and you can read about it. I mean, the lace making woman would be sitting outside the front door doing it because she got the light, and she needed the light for her work.
Yeah.
And, obviously, you've got little windows, and you know, even your little tapers made of grease. I mean, they're not giving you much light, and then it all costs.
Yes, any form of lighting.
So any time when it's not actually raining or snow on the ground or whatever, you're working outside in daylight hours.
Yeah.
I did go with John to the Shaftesbury jaunt, and it's well worth walking down Gold Hill to the street at the bottom that John was talking about.
St James's Street, yeah.
I mean, I can't say anything about it other than the fact that, you know, I had a little sort of guided tour along that street by John, and it was really worth having a look at.
They've got a nice little public garden there as well.
Yes.
I was touring around Shaftesbury with a friend whose son and grandchild lives there quite recently, and we walked along James Street as far as the school at the end where the grandchild goes.
Yeah. But it's excellent exercise walking back up Gold Hill.
Yes,
really
we found that
feel
too.
it here.
We stopped for my benefit and sat on the bench for a short time.
Yes, yeah. And John, just some of the terminology. So mullions are the old-fashioned.
Those are the stone divisions within a window frame.
Oh, so that's the stone divisions.
Yeah.
Those are the mullions.
Yeah. And stanchions are the bit that go across.
Oh right. Okay.
But I didn't mention those.
Oh right. Okay. Is that 18th century or
that's
or
17th? That's 16th and 17th century usually.
Right. Okay.
And the other way of kind of checking on the authenticity, the older ones have what are called drip mouldings that go around the top, so that the surface water doesn't run into the window frame.
And there was a glossary page just sat there.
Yes, maybe that's what we need. And there was another word that I hadn't come across before. Clunch, was it clunge? Clunch.
Yes, it's chalk used in blocks.
Sorry?
Chalk used in blocks.
Chalk in blocks.
Yeah.
Right.
And you know how crumbly chalk can be. So yeah.
Right. Okay. Yes, Anne.
Can I ask a question? What about sanitation and water supplies? Because there are so many cases, which I used to know in Sussex, where you had an outside loo, no sanitation inside the cottages.
I mean, I don't think Dorset was different from any other county in the dates of the evolution of proper interior sanitation. Those houses at Kimmeridge that I showed, that run of houses there, that has a separate kind of laundry block at the back, the other side of a tiny yard, and I think that's where the first close loos were. Water supply, interesting. I mean, there are lots of villages which have, certainly near the chalk downland, which have beautifully clear water streams in them, or what before agricultural chemicals and stuff would have been. I mean, it's still beautifully clear, but I would imagine it's probably got a fair lot of nasties in it now. But that they used to channel them down the centre of the street, and I presume people just simply help themselves for water from there. Where Sidling, St Nicholas, Winterbourne, Stickland, Wool, all of those villages have channelled running water all the way through the middle of them. I presume there would be wells and pumps too. And again, I presume there would be outdoor privies, and there would have been the refuse would be mixed with ash and probably used as a fertiliser as well after it had decayed for a while. So I couldn't give you a history of bathrooms and when they became an integral part of housing, but I would imagine.
But also for cooking in the kitchen.
Yes, there was a sink.
Did they have to go out for water, or what was it available?
I'm not. I don't know when piped water became universal. Probably in towns before in the country. I would imagine there were village pumps, and I mean, I know you used to fill your cistern on top of, or as part of the range at the beginning of the day, and draw hot water from that. And the range was the heating for the room that you lived in and used most of all, which was the kitchen and the family eating room. Obviously there were fireplaces in all of the others, and the great brick, the vast areas of brick around the fireplaces also worked a bit like storage heaters, yes. And certainly in a lot of Welsh farmhouses, there's the big central chimney breast, and beds and bed spaces were kind of built into its extension upwards. So you went to bed in a kind of ready warmed area, and some of those bed areas also had doors which folded over the bed area to stop the warmth dispersing from there as well. So the chimney and the range acted as a kind of permanent radiator in many ways.
So they were cosier than...
Yes, well, I mean, you always hear stories of people feeling that their fronts were really hot, and their backs were always cold. And I mean, when I grew up, we didn't have... I remember when the central heating was put in our house, but I do remember that you would get close to the fire, and you'd feel a bit chilly behind you.
One of our members has offered to give us a talk on the history of the toilet. We're just trying to find the right slot in the programme to do. Jeff Kirby, who lives in Weymouth or Dorchester, he's written numerous books, and so he's offered us that talk. So maybe at some point we'll do that if you're up for that.
We want that, I think.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, it is fascinating. Yeah.
Only if there are no puns.
Oh.
No childish jokes.
Yeah, well.
Like we ought to be privy to it.
Any more questions? Did I miss anyone? John, maybe a couple of final ones. Do you have a favourite stone? You were talking about some of the stones.
Yeah.
Is there one that you...
I mean, I do like the hamstone.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
And a big house in that. I mean, do you know Montacute in Somerset?
Yeah.
Well, obviously that's kind of 200 yards away from Ham Hill, roughly. And that is amazing. It's just that it reacts to the sun very well. And also, when it gets lichen on it doesn't seem to spoil it. Anyway, its mottledness is rather attractive. And the other thing with bearing in mind, I mean, Purbeck stone has a huge range of colours. Until I started looking into this, I just thought, Purbeck stone is Purbeck stone, but it isn't. I mean, the colour range within Purbeck stone is huge. So that's quite interesting. But no, I mean, I like the yellow stone of, Hamstone and that northern area.
And Sherborne Abbey, is that made from the same stone, Hamstone?
Yeah.
That's a really lovely
golden
colour.
yeah.
Yeah.
So is it named after the hill, or is the hill named after it?
Hill.
It's named after the village of Stoke. Oh well, Stoke Subhampton. Now that begs the question, doesn't it? So I presume it's named after the locality.
Yeah, or I mean, the quarries,
Yeah.
there.
And do you have a favourite village?
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure
Westbourne.
I'll keep on discovering more. Some of them in West Dorset are particularly lovely. But the thing I also discovered is you get used to so much noise and traffic. I mean, I was in Nether Compton for about 3/4 of an hour, and I think I saw 3 cars, and all of these, and just the only thing that I saw at Stoke Abbott were 2 builders' vans which moved. Otherwise, it was completely. And the silence in these places is quite extraordinary. If you're used to living in a town, I'd forgotten that. What it was like.
But that's the ones that aren't on a main road to somewhere or other still, isn't it?
Yes.
Whereas if they're on the main road, they've got the lorry sort of rushing past
Yes.
about this distance from
Yeah, I mean,
the facade of the house.
Shillingstone is,
Yeah.
is like that.
You know, I said my friend lived in that house, that's why she moved.
Yes,
It was
it's
just
on the
horrendous
road.
noise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a bit
And of course,
backdrop,
this
yeah.
sort of silence wasn't what you had a couple of hundred years ago, because there'd be constant noise of children, I imagine. Whereas now they're owned by weekenders, so
Yeah.
a real rarity to have children,
I-
young children
yeah.
screaming.
I mean, I was reading the draft county policy on housing the other day, and you know, we think that the whole of Dorset is full of second homes, but they're actually concentrated in and around the Isle of Purbeck and in North Dorset, and there's quite a sprinkling elsewhere. And that county policy, I don't know whether they've adopted it yet, they're in building developments above 9 houses. In the Isle of Purbeck, the proposers of such developments have to guarantee between, I think, 25 and 40% of affordable housing in that build. And so in the areas where there are high levels of second homes, the direction for affordable housing is much higher than areas where there isn't. And of course the whole policy is framed in the fact that Dorset has an unusually high level of house cost price and an unusually low level of average earnings. So there's the worst possible sort of situation. So that they're trying to move policy so that there's much more affordable housing built in the near future, to kind of remedy the imbalances that have come about in the last 20, 30 years. Last one, and then we'll...
Yeah, about a month ago, a friend of mine was, he'd sold a sofa to somebody in Worthmer Travis and needed a hand to get it there, so I went with it. It was only a 2-seater sofa, but it was a cottage we arrived to, and it was a picture of one of your cottages, low roofs, everything. Couldn't go through the front door, it just wouldn't fit, so we had to go round the back, through the kitchen, angle it all upside down, and we were trying to get, it was quite a nightmare. So I think cottages just aren't made for modern furniture, so that's another issue.
Yeah. Well, I hope next time you venture into Dorset, you'll open your eyes and look at some of the things that John has pointed out. There's a fantastic thing about John. He sort of gets people to just look at these things and open your eyes and just see what's around instead of maybe going around in a daze as I tend to. Please give John another big round of applause.